Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the Soundcore by Anker Liberty 5 True Wireless Buds. Now, if you're having deja vu, it's because a couple of months ago we checked out the Soundcore Liberty 4 Pros and also the 4 NCs, but what's curious is the original Liberty 4 actually came out over 2 years ago, so it's been a very long release cycle, and in the time since, again, they've been filling it with other members of the Liberty 4 line, like the aforementioned NC or the Pro model, so now the Gen 5 era is kicking off with the Liberty 5, and we'll see if the 5 Pro as well as the 5 NC follow up in the coming months. Speaking of those other family members though, the Pro model is usually where Soundcore stacks all of their bells and whistles, for example having dual drivers compared to this regular Liberty 5 is using a single driver setup. Also, we saw the 4 Pro have a screen built into the case that can be used to interact with controls, so it's a little bit more fancy and probably still has slightly stronger performance if you're looking for audio quality even now, as compared to the Liberty 5 that is a bit more streamlined but also more affordable as well. In terms of colors, you have quite a few options to pick between, including this white version, also a classic black, blue, and apricot or pink, and battery life continues to be rather impressive, lasting upwards of 48 hours with the battery case, up to 32 hours if you have active noise cancellation turned on, and around 8 to 12 hours of continuous music listening when being worn. They are rated IP55 for water resistance, can be charged wirelessly, and this time around what's new is they have a Dolby Atmos certification for the first time in the Liberty line. Now, it might be more of a marketing play with that branding more than anything else, though it does provide you with a kind of spatial effect EQ mode that we'll also see later in this video. Again, the Adaptive ANC means that it's adjusting the intensity depending on your surroundings from second to second, and similar to the Liberty 4 Pros, it has a touch-sensitive stem that you can squeeze on to trigger special commands, including using them as a selfie remote control function, which is kind of playful. And just like before, you have access to Soundcore's Hear ID, which is their flagship feature within the Soundcore app for Android and iOS devices, which can create a custom EQ after performing a hearing test, personalizing the sound to your taste. They're also going to be Hi-Res Audio Wireless certified because it supports the LDAC audio codec up to 3 times more detail wirelessly. However, keep in mind that LDAC is currently only compatible with Android devices, and so if you're an iPhone user, you won't be able to take full advantage of that, unfortunately. Now, they are packing 9.2mm drivers inside using the latest Bluetooth 5.4 and remains relatively lightweight at 4.6 grams for the buds. Furthermore, the squeeze controls on the stems can also be used to mute the microphones, which there are 6 of them built on in for better noise cancellation. Also, more specifically for the ANC, they claim that the effectiveness on this generation has been improved for human voices. That tends to be an area that has been harder to repress in traditional ANC tech. Usually it just dampens out lower frequency sounds like engines and fan noises, and for the internal structure this time, they have used an interesting bass boosting tube material that supposedly further increases the resonance if you're listening to drum beats. We can see a breakdown chart over here. So versus the original Liberty 4s from 2 years ago, you can see the pricing here has actually slightly decreased by around $20. That being said, because the Liberty 4 Pros and 4 NCs have been out for a little while, you can actually find those 2 models at a similar cost these days to the newest Liberty 5. Just keep that in mind. Again, supposedly Liberty 5 will have the best active noise cancellation performance out of the bunch, although when it comes to sound quality, because of the dual driver setup, the 4 Pros are still going to be the winner in this department. Furthermore, when it comes to spatial 3D audio, again, these ones are going to be Dolby Atmos certified, which is the new feature. However, the 4 Pros and the original 4 had a built-in accelerometer for head tracking. Battery life with the case, though, is going to be a touch longer compared to the 4 Pros, and especially compared to the original Liberty 4s, where only around 28 hours with the case versus, again, 48 hours. Last but not least, when it comes to the newer novelty functions, the Liberty 5's stem, which can be squeezed, are used to control the microphones or take photos with the camera, compared to on the Liberty 4s, there was actually a built-in heart rate sensor, kind of like a smartwatch. It can track your pulse. That being said, a heart rate monitor built into headphones probably isn't as practical as on a smartwatch because you aren't wearing these every single minute of the day. So the data isn't going to be as exhaustive. It's kind of like when Samsung built a heart rate monitor on their older Galaxy S series phones. Maybe it wasn't used all that often for most users, and so it was cut later on down the line to further reduce the price point. So although it was cool to see, it's not a deal breaker in my opinion. And on the inside, there's access to just a quick start guide that tells you again how to access those squeeze controls. And then further down below, you have access to a quick user guide, plus underneath this little box, you have additional sets of silicone tips to get a more snug and comfortable fit, plus the usual USB Type-C charging cable. Closer look at the design of the casing here, we still have that slider form factor, similar to the original Liberty 4s, which is pretty sleek and easy to use. It's a matte plastic material, but doesn't feel too hollow, still has a decent overall density to it. There's access to a USB Type-C port, or you can rely on wireless charging with any Qi charging pad. Just pop it on there and the charging will start. There's an LED status bar on the front that will flash with other basic notifications, including when it is updating the software. You'll see a playful animation of the bar rippling across the side of the case as the software update is in progress as a status bar, which I think is a pretty cool subtle touch, showing a little more attention to detail. As for dimensions, we have the Liberty 4 NCs side by side, and they're actually quite similar in terms of overall case. They can both slide pretty easily into a pocket when you're traveling or on the go. Here it is next to an average around 6.5-inch phone, just to serve as reference. The door mechanism is a little different though, with the 4NC popping open with a spring-assisted button on the front compared to the slider design of the Liberty 5s. Here's also a side-by-side with the original Liberty 4, and both the 4 and also the 5 now are using the same slider design for the door, as well as having that LED light bar here on the front. The new one might be just a little bit larger, however it seems to be foregoing some of the accent lights on the inside that we once had, making them glow when they popped in. So as part of that streamlining to bring down the price, it looks like that's one more aspect or small detail that got further cut, so you can see the difference there. Otherwise though, again, the shape remains still quite similar. As for the buds themselves, they're held into place pretty securely using magnets. We're able to see the aforementioned squeeze controls located on the edge of the buds, which is a slight dimple area. Again, a little bit reminiscent of something like the maybe AirPods, but not in a bad way, instead of a button being on the front, so it doesn't add as much pressure. So I find these to actually be a little bit more comfortable because you aren't actually squeezing them into your ears every time that you're hitting on them, but rather it's on the side, remaining relatively comfortable even for light movements. Now if we remove the silicone tips, we can see that the mesh here is also made out of metal, making them a little bit easier to clean, wipe down, and overall feeling robust enough. Here's also a quick size comparison with the Liberty 4 NCs. Again, the size of the stems might be just a little bit shorter this time around, but the overall design and fit aren't dramatically different. Briefly exploring the Soundcore app, it's pretty fast to pair once you just pop open the door and have Bluetooth turn on. You can see the battery percentage remaining on the left, right sides, as well as in the battery case as well. Furthermore, the Liberty 5s do support Google's Fast Pair protocol, so if you have a newer Android phone, really the first time you pop open the lid, it will be detected nearby as a pop-up notification, similar to on AirPods, and you're able to connect them to your Google account, meaning that in the future, even if you're changing phones, it will still be connected to your profile for easier setup. And afterwards, it goes through a quick tutorial of how to trigger those squeeze controls as well. Now tapping inside, we're able to gauge the current profile, go into an ANC mode versus audio transparency mode. And speaking of, in the active noise cancellation, aside from changing it automatically, you can also have a manual mode of changing the intensity higher or lower, as well as try out a transportation mode if you're on a flight or traveling by car, reducing the engine sounds. Likewise, for audio transparency mode, it's using the microphones to amplify the sound around you if you want to have a conversation with someone without removing the buds and hear what's going on. However, for the audio transparency mode, you don't get the granular sliders that we saw for the ANC. Scrolling further down, we have access to the EQ controls, and you have plenty of those to play around with, including the brand new Dolby audio functionality. It's just advertised there right on the very top, which further enables a music playback, podcast for speech, or a movie mode. So this is similar to a surround sound EQ profile, just making the overall music maybe a little bit more immersive, especially if you're watching a movie. But if you're looking for the most detail or accuracy, I find that the Soundcore signature or using the Hear ID modes might be more beneficial. Which, speaking of, down below here, you're able to trigger the preference tests. Taking around 2 minutes, it will play back a sound and then ask you if you preferred sound 1 or sound 2. And at the end of the test, it will create your own customized curve based on how much you prefer bass, mids, and trebles. If you're not able to discern certain details, it might bump up the volume of neighboring frequencies to ensure that you can hear it. Now, under more advanced settings, you can further tweak that custom EQ, adjusting it slightly more based on your preferences with the default there as the baseline, as well as merge merging together some presets with your own EQ. For example, you can tap here to find options like acoustic, bass boost, bass reduce, and apply this as an average with your own Hear ID test, kind of taking the mean or the average of those two values, also showing a little bit more attention to detail. Alternatively, if you want to fiddle around with the EQ sliders yourself, you have that option and you can save it as another profile, or just find some of the general presets, including the soundcore signature, the same kind of genre specific and bass boosted, bass reduced modes that we saw there earlier can all be found. So the Soundcore app remains pretty exhaustive from the perspective of EQ. As for controls, you're able to remap what the squeeze there can trigger, including a single, double press, triple press, and also a long press. Plus, when you're in a call or meeting, you can activate functions like the squeeze to mute microphone feature, turning that on or off. And you're able to reassign these controls to do things like adjust the volume, again, skip tracks, pretty much everything that you would want. Final tap here is going to be the gaming mode, aka the low latency mode. So if you're watching also a movie or doing a high frame rate game, this will reduce the lag between the video and the audio. However, it will also slightly compress the audio as well. So if you're listening to music, you can probably turn this function off. Now under the gear icon, you can find even more advanced settings, including a wearing detection sensor is also built into the hardware. So if you remove the buds, they will automatically play and pause the music. Again, Soundcore's Liberty line is usually stacked to the brim with software features, and we see that again on this model, including even adaptive sound leakage compensation. So it's using the external microphones if you're listening to music to detect if there's too much sound leaking out. It can also try and slightly reduce the volume automatically to give you better privacy, which is actually a pretty smart function if you're out in public, for example, that I haven't seen on many other pairs of headphones, including a safe volume as well if you're giving them to kids to prevent long-term hearing loss. And you can also turn on and off functions like the touch tones, disabling those notifications if you find it to be too obtrusive. You can also go into a sound mode here to turn on the LDAC high-res audio wireless mode. Now, I would still like them to put this into the home page of the UI instead of currently kind of tucking it away under some of the advanced settings, making it a little harder to find and access. But again, this is basically the opposite of the low latency gaming mode. Instead, this will increase the latency. However, it will improve the audio quality if you're listening to a studio album. Furthermore, the Liberty 5s do have dual connectivity support, allowing you to pair simultaneously to something like a laptop and a phone at the same time. So if you're listening to audio and switching back and forth between those devices, the headphones will intelligently switch back and forth as well. You can also automatically turn them off after X minutes of inactivity, trigger a chime on the headphones to locate the left or right buds if they've fallen underneath the sofa or table, as well as check for firmware updates. And because they support the Google Fast Pair protocol, as long as you're paired to your phone, you can use your phone's GPS to kind of estimate the last known location of the headphones as well if you're checking it on a map, even though there is no chip built directly into the case itself. So leveraging connected GPS. Overall, again, quite feature stacked, and the app remains, I think, a highlight overall for most of Soundcore's products. This is really no exception. Glad to see they're still offering that custom hearing test mode, and it remains easy enough to customize all the controls. Moving into sound quality and performance, luckily this is an area where the Liberty 5 also mostly holds up. That is, despite the single driver setup, they are still quite nuanced, packing sufficient bass, volume as well for them to sound satisfying and quite loud, while still providing you with some details of vocals and instrumentals. Now, like we touched on earlier, if you are comparing them with the Liberty 4 Pros, because those pack in even higher end drivers, aka speakers, you can still kind of hear that difference if you are an audiophile. Those are maybe around 20% even better sounding. However, if you are more of a casual listener and you're not comparing them side by side, in a vacuum, these already sound excellent. And again, the default profile with Soundcore Signature is already quite aggressive when it comes to providing a kick with bass, but not necessarily overpowering either. But for smaller buds, they are actually quite impressive without losing controls of the mids and trebles. So it's a pretty satisfying experience that's easy to get used to the moment that you start listening to music with them. Now, maybe the bigger question though is compared to Liberty 4s and 4NCs, how do they stack up? And I would say if you are a bass head, Liberty 5s do have a touch more bass as part of that new acoustic chamber design, providing a bit more of that resonance. However, it's not going to be a dramatic night and day difference either, because I found honestly the 4NCs and regular 4s to already be pretty satisfying as well. So we've reached a point in these wireless headphones that really there's no longer pairs in their collection that I honestly think sounds mediocre. So it's hard harder and harder to kind of differentiate them apart. So although on the merits of sound alone, it's not going to be a revolutionary leap, if you're coming from an older generation pair, maybe your battery is starting to get worn out, then this is still going to provide you with a more than satisfactory experience, offering pleasing detail, pretty good bass for smaller buds, which by the way you can also turn down using the bass reduce mode or some of your custom EQ profiles. If you don't like that particular sound, they can be more treble forward instead and doesn't sound too shrill or harsh or sibilant even when listening to higher notes. As for active noise cancellation, again, the software here perhaps is a little more optimized and sophisticated than before, and versus the Liberty 4s, it is definitely going to be more effective and stronger performing on these. That being said, again, versus the 4 Pros and even the 4 NCs, I think in general circumstances, there's not going to be a world's difference apart, which is to say, you can definitely notice the difference when you turn them on versus off, and I appreciate the improved performance of canceling out some murmurs and human voices. And overall, the sound quality in terms of the EQ, the tuning doesn't really change even when you have it turned on versus off. So it's a pleasant, slightly above average performer in this regard, getting a little closer, I'd say, to some of the industry leaders, including Bose's and Sony's, which are kind of the benchmark for ANC tech. Controls and ergonomics of the squeeze sensor were also relatively responsive and comfortable enough to use in practice. Here's a quick demo of the microphone quality that were recorded earlier. Here's a quick test of the microphone quality on the Liberty 5 wireless buds. How do they sound? Test, 1, 2, 3. So I thought it sounded actually not bad, and it can pick up your voice maybe a little easier compared to dot-shaped wireless buds because the stem with the microphone here is pointing a little closer to your mouth. So if you're doing things like conferencing, having a meeting, a phone call, it's actually going to work decently. It is clear and audible enough. Even if there's a bit of background chatter or some fan noise, it tends to repress it as part of the environmental noise cancellation. So there we have it. That is more or less it as far as our quick hands-on review of the Soundcore Liberty 5, the start of the 5th generation era from the Liberty line by Soundcore. And I think the rollout here is an interesting one because in some ways it may be perceived as a little confusing just because the original Liberty 4s again came out over 2 years ago. And in the time since, they've rolled out incremental updates including the 4 NCs and also the latest 4 Pros that just came out recently. So it felt like we were in that cycle for a pretty long time. And now finally there's a successor to the original Liberty 4s. But it also means that the 4 NCs that came out not so long ago are actually going to be quite similar to these Liberty 5s, since those incremental models in between haven't been as far apart. Still, the Liberty 5 provides a pretty beautiful design remaining quite classy with still excellent sound in its class, considering they're still very feature-stacked wireless buds with high-res wireless audio at the end of the day. But based on their release schedule, since the Liberty 4 Pros came out just a few months back, we'll have to see. Maybe it's going to be another year and a half until the 5 Pros come out. So in the time being, this might be more of a refreshed version of the baseline Liberty series. It also cuts some of the clutter, including the heart rate monitor that might have been a more niche function, and instead provides us with a slightly lower entry price point. So you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. Still a solid option, I would say, when it comes to sound quality and overall performance. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Liberty 5 from Soundcore.